of our colleagues on generate and the extract, transform, and load process. We've invited you to join today, you as in the states implementing generate as part of CIID, to participate in today's training as a beginning step in ensuring the smooth transition of ownership of generate maintenance. As such, we'll spend the next hour reviewing ETL and answering any questions that you all have within generate. And then anything that's not addressed here, certainly you'll always be able to reach out to your CIID TA team members and make sure to address anything that comes up in your upcoming calls that you all have with your TA members. As a reminder, today's webinar will be recorded. You'll be muted, as the slide shows here. However, we'll unmute the lines if we have time at the end of the call. We also have the QA box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you have any questions, really encourage you to put those in there, whether they're specific to your state or in general. We're more than happy to collect any and all questions you have there. If you have a state-specific question, if we have time, we'll try to answer it on the call, but certainly we'll make sure it's answered or passed along to your TA team and directly addressed. As I said, today's webinar will be recorded, so if one of your colleagues were not able to join today, it'll be available on afterwards as well. So with that, I'll pass the mic over to Dwayne Brown, who will be kind of kicking off today's webinar. And if any and all questions you may have, please put them in the QA box on the bottom right-hand corner. Dwayne?
Sure thing. Thanks, Aaron. This is Dwayne Brown. I'm one of the members of the CIID Technical Assistance team, and I'll be presenting today. We also have Nathan Clinton and Johnny Cunningham, who are also CIID Technical Assistance team members. One of the three of us is working, I'm sure, directly with your state, but any of us can help with anything that you have, so you'll be able to reach out to the three of us. Our email addresses will be at the end. If you have any questions or need some follow-up that are technical in nature, you can reach out to your project team or to one of us, and we can assist you with that. So I'll be doing the presentation today and chatting with you about the different things. We're going to provide you with quite a bit of information, but given we only have an hour, it's going to be somewhat high level. And at the end, we're going to highlight some resources that are presently available to you and will be available to you in the near future as well that we're currently working on. And as I mentioned, all three individuals, myself, Nathan Clinton, Johnny Cunningham, were able to support you in understanding the process I'm going to go over today. We structured the agenda to follow the flow of the data from your source systems all the way through until the EDFacts report is created. So after we go through that flow, again, we'll mention some resources, and then we'll take questions at the end there. So this is the agenda. We're going to start off with taking a look at the migration and the steps that we go through to get the data basically essentially converted into an EDFacts report that you submit. So there are essentially 4 steps the data go through to produce the EDFacts report. Those are staging, and then it moves on to the CEDS integrated data store. From there, it goes into the CEDS data warehouse, and then finally into the reports tables. All of the data migration process is housed in a single generate database. So it's one structure. And basically, to put the whole process simply, at the bottom of the screen, you take your data, you turn it into CEDS, and then you produce the report. Generate produces the report out of that. So it's simple enough to understand conceptually, but we're going to dig in a little bit more into how that actually works. The first thing that has to be understood, since we're talking about CEDS, is what is CEDS? If you're not familiar with it, hopefully many of you on the call are, but maybe you don't actually do a lot of work or haven't done with the Generate project, so it's important to kind of explain what CEDS is. It's the Common Education Data Standards. It's sponsored by the National Center for Educational Statistics. It's a community-driven and built P20W standard that defines unit record level data elements in the education space. And CEDS is nearly almost 10 years old in just a couple months. It contains over 1,700 P20W elements. CEDS contains tools such as Align, Connect, and MyConnect, and those are there to help you explore the CEDS elements. It helps you to see how those elements align with your particular systems. It helps you to build data integration projects using CEDS. So those tools are available to you. CEDS is also a physical data model, as I mentioned earlier in that thing, the integrated data store in the warehouse, for storing unit record data. So you can think of CEDS as sort of the first step to beginning your Generate implementation. Since you will be transforming your data into CEDS, you have to first align your source systems to CEDS, and that's why one of the first things the CIID team has any state do is identify those source systems and then create a CEDS align map. And that align map provides information to the developers, which would be, in this call, many of you, and then as well to the TA providers that are helping you do some of the development work for where to retrieve the data in that source system, and then also how to align the option sets and various things as they're converted over to CEDS. So we're going to take a quick look at Align right now, just so you have an understanding of what that is. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and you should be seeing the CEDS web page there. And we're going to take a look at tools and Align. I'll just show you kind of briefly something that you would see in there. So I'm going to go and explore. I'm not logged in, so you're able to do some of these things as well. These are just maps that have been published by different states. We'll take a look at one here real quick in Washington. Washington Assessment of Student Learning. Take a look at the data dictionary. Basically, Washington at some point went through and mapped from their particular location the different elements that they have stored in a system, and they've mapped those over then to the CEDS element. So on the left side here, that's the state's element. These are the one or many CEDS elements, and then there's some information about how closely it's aligned to CEDS. So this is assessment information, just kind of scrolling through here, some things that might make a little more sense. For instance, an ethnicity code linked over to Hispanic or Latino ethnicity, ethnicity code 2 linked over here, so various different ethnicity codes, how those link over. Obviously, first name here, FRE eligibility, something related to free reduced eligibility status for school food service programs. So you can see that there's a process for taking your particular elements and your source systems, your column names, that sort of thing, and then it maps over to a CEDS element. And that's, if you're going to integrate data into CEDS out of a system, that's the first step you'd have to take. And another tool that CEDS has is Connect. And so we're going to kind of take this to the other end of it and take a look at a particular connection. Let's look at C175, since we were just talking about assessments. And we'll grab this map assessment here real quick and take a look. So when we go and we build out, well, what are the elements we need to actually build the EDFacts reports, we take and we list out the CEDS elements that are necessary to actually build C175. So if Generate's going to build that EDFacts report for you, what elements does it need to be able to create that report? And so the connection is basically the question, and the align map is actually the answer for where the data is at. So the question would be, how do I build 175? These are the elements you need. And then, okay, well, where are those elements, those CEDS elements, stored in my particular system? Well, MyConnect lets you go over and take a look at Align. So we're going to grab that Washington map again and that assessment, and we're going to take a look at those elements lined together. So if I need those particular elements in CEDS, where are those inside my Washington map? Well, here's the academic subject, and here's information that was aligned to academic subject for Washington. Here's some elements in that particular map of Washington that aren't aligned. And here's additional ones, scale score, raw scores that align over to the results. And here are the race codes that are inside the Washington map. Here are the CEDS element race codes that are necessary. So it's kind of the first step in mapping your source systems over to CEDS. Now we've kind of, the business side is done and a slight amount of the technical side is done. We know about where in your source systems to look. We know where that data lives. And so then it's time to actually start writing the scripts to actually move the data out of that source system and into CEDS structure. So it's the first step there. And a lot of these reports can be downloaded. They provide information such as the CEDS global ID is contained on every one of the CEDS elements, and that tells you where in CEDS the particular element goes. So the first step is actually just doing some align mapping and then and getting your data ready to be loaded into CEDS to understand where that data comes from. All right, so now that we have that, we are going to take a look at the data flow. The first place we're going to begin is the staging tables. The staging tables were created to ease the process of learning CEDS. The second step in the data flow, which is the CEDS integrated data store, we'll go over in a second. It actually contains over 700 tables. It's very normalized. It has many different primary and foreign key constraints. Ultimately, the goal is to get the data into that structure because that's the CEDS normalized standard structure. But learning the ins and outs of that right off can be a bit challenging, so that's why we've created the staging process. The staging process is a temporary step for your data. It lives there temporarily, and then it's loaded into the IDS. And then as you go to load something else, it's truncated, and then new data is moved into the staging process. That's loaded into the IDS, and then as you go to load something else, staging is truncated, and the data is moved in there again. And so the staging process is a temporary flow of your data, and the staging tables are structured more like a flat file with all of the CEDS elements listed. So it's much easier for the learning curve to navigate. It's all based on identifiers. Let me show you here an example of a staging table. So here's an example of a staging table. This staging table, this particular one, is the person status table. The first column there is the student identifier state. So that's the unique identifier your state assigns to a student. The next two elements are the LEA, the school identifiers, and then after that we start to get into statuses along with start and end dates about the student. So homeless, economic disadvantage, migrant, military, special ed, IDEA, et cetera. And most of these are simple yes-no questions that we would need to know about that particular student in that particular school at that particular LEA. So either the student is or is not economically disadvantaged, and the dates help guide when the data is used. So if it was for October 1, for instance, or is it for assessments, is there a particular time for assessments? Those dates can help determine when it's loaded, when that particular status makes sense. It could be for a particular discipline incident that the student goes through, and that incident occurred on a certain day, and so there's different things for loading that. So basically, step one in the data flow is to get your data into the staging tables. And there's documentation that's created to help with this process. Is the CEDS aligned map, right? So we just talked about that gets you, here's your data, your source systems over to CEDS. And the staging tables represent CEDS elements. And so that mapping process makes it easier to get the data into staging. There's also the CIID ETL Checklist, which is an Excel file that helps provide documentation. We are working on actually expanding that out, and it will have the entire data flow from your source system all the way into the IDS, all the way into the data warehouse, into the reports and the transformations and the option set. So it's a very detailed report. There's templates available that can be used. And then as myself and Johnny and Nathan work in your states, we're also building these out from the reports that we're working on to provide very detailed documentation of the flow of the data from the start to the finish. You can also see that the staging tables, the way they're grouped, it's by common domains. So we have staging tables for assessments. There's a staging table related to discipline. The one we just talked about is person status. So each of the staging tables contain the minimum elements necessary to complete the reporting. And to do a particular set of reports, certain staging tables are populated. So if you were doing assessments, you wouldn't need to populate discipline or charter school management organizations. If you were doing directory information, you would need to populate all the organization tables. If you're doing, child count, you would need to populate the program participation, special education, and some information about the student. So like discipline, for instance, we need the discipline table. We would also need to populate the enrollment so we know where the kid's at. We would need to do the program participation special ed for those discipline files. We would need the person race, we'd need the person status, and the organization of person tables. But we wouldn't need the assessments. So they're grouped together in different domains, and you put the data in as needed for the reports that you're loading into the IDS at that point, depending on the source table. I'm going to take a look now and show you kind of an example script, if I can find the share button. Again, there we go. Let's pull this up. So this one, for instance, is enrollment. And so we provide templates for actually loading the data. And for each of the staging tables, there are scripts that you can run. So here's a simple one. First thing it does, as I mentioned, it truncates the staging table enrollment. So staging enrollment is truncated, and then you go and you're going to insert the data into staging table. Where does the data come from? That's up to you. Here's an example of one we're doing with an EdFi state where we're pulling data in from an EdFi ODS to actually load the enrollment information. And you can see some of these are null. Depends on what you're pulling in as well. So there's values, so class of, school year, cohort, graduation could be left null, or it could be done further down depending on what you're doing. That would be related to, graduation reports and dropout reports and that sort of thing. So you're able to select from whatever your location is and load that data into the staging table. Here's some update statements to add additional things into there. And essentially, that's all it is. We set a run date time on a particular staging table, and then there's a validation process that is run that essentially looks through the data and does some validation on it, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. So for each of the different staging tables, there are scripts. Sometimes there's more than one staging table loaded inside of one of the templates. But effectively, what your goal is as a state to load the data into Generate is to be able to populate these staging tables. Let me go ahead and go back over here and talk about the source system reference data. So another item to understand about the staging tables is the source system reference data table. There's a table that we also have. It's located inside of Generate, contains those 5 columns that you can see there, and it's the source for translating your option sets into the CEDS option sets for a particular element. So when you load the staging table with something like race, you don't need to change your option sets. You just load them the way you have them in your source system. Then the source system reference data table, it will contain the mapping from your race code to the CEDS race code. So you can see that there on the screen, I equals American Indian or Alaska Native. So the source system for whatever this system is, they have I, A, B, P, C. And those are mapped over to the output codes, which are the CEDS race codes for how that's mapped. So it's true of any of the elements you would load the staging that have option sets. So like disability, assessment types administered to children with disabilities, whether that's regular or altered assessments. And because option sets can change from year to year in your own systems, and then potentially also can change in EDFacts and CEDS as well, a school year is placed on that table to keep track of the historical option sets. So each year you can, if there's no change, you would just roll that year over into the new year. If there are particular changes, you would make those changes and make them year-based. So when Generate looks back at a previous year, it sees what it was the year before. It looks at a current year. It's looking at the new option sets there. All right, and so kind of summing up the staging table section, the primary objective is to load the staging tables from your source systems, wherever those are. And then you would go in, you would map your option sets to CEDS in the source system reference data table. Generate handles the creation and the maintenance of the staging table structure. And then the Generate team presently is working on a package that includes ETL templates for all 84 EDFacts reports. So Generate is capable right now of producing the 84 EDFacts reports. We presently in the CIID states have the templates available for all of the IDEA reports, but we have additional ones that part of the package from a different funding source that's allowing us to produce all of the 84 EDFacts reports, templates for those as well. So for each staging table, there's a set of ETL code and a template format that's provided that's going to help you load that particular staging table. And for each staging table necessary to do the EDFacts reports, we have that. So we're working on those now. We hope to have those completed this summer and make that available to you sometime early fall or near the end of the summer. And along with that, there'll be a documentation basically that explains the implementation process in greater detail than what I'm even able to cover here on this particular call. So that's step one, is basically get your data into staging. Once your data is into staging, it now has to move into the integrated data store, and this is the normalized section. I spent quite a bit of time on staging because that's where the primary work from the state is going to occur. At that point, the data must move out of the staging tables and into the CEDS IDS, the integrated data store. But good news, you just loaded your data, right, into staging. So that's a standard staging structure, and your option sets are all mapped to CEDS. So that means the ETL is going from a standard set of tables, which are the staging tables, over to a standard set of tables, which is the CEDS integrated data store. And we, the CIID team, have completed much of that code for you to move that data from one place to the other. And we're continuing to work on those ETLs for all 84 EDFacts reports. So there's a set of code that takes the data out of staging and moves it into the IDS or the IDS. That's why we spend more time on staging. If you can get your data into staging, we have scripts that do the rest, that basically take it all the way through the rest of the process for you. So let's take a look here. As I mentioned earlier, the CEDS IDS contains over 700 tables that are all integrated in a highly normalized way with each other. So when you install Generate, you're not only downloading just the CEDS tables necessary to do the EDFacts reports, you are in fact downloading the complete IDS, which contains every P20W CEDS element as part of that structure. So as you get comfortable with Generate, your next logical step would probably end up being, what else can we do with this CEDS integrated structure, right? You're going to find ways to incorporate additional data columns or data into columns and tables that are already in CEDS for other purposes. So an example, you already have all your assessments loaded in, right? All the assessment data is loaded in because you have to do the assessment reports for EDFacts reporting. Why not load your state's learning and competency standards into CEDS and then link it to the assessment data? So now you have all your learning standards linked to assessment results. So that's something that, additional uses you can do. And finally, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the good news is out of the staging tables, we have what we've called encapsulated code for most of the reports and still have a few to go. But by the end of the summer, we plan to have all that code available as part of a complete package to assist with implementation. And let me go over here and kind of show you an example of what that looks like. Sharing my screen again. So essentially, if you look over here, we have this one is called Implementation Step 3 Enrollment. And this next one is called Implementation Step 3 Enrollment Encapsulated Code. So the enrollment is where the staging tables are, and the state-specific information is to put your data, your source systems, over to the staging tables. The encapsulated code takes the data out of the staging tables and then loads it into CEDS. And so you can see here it begins the process of moving that data into those locations. There are joins here. I don't know if I can show you a particular join. In this one, I might have picked an example that doesn't have it to the source system reference data, so we'll forget that for now. But it's loading the data into the organization person role table, which is effectively the enrollment table for CEDS. So the encapsulated code goes through, takes all of the data out of staging, and loads it into the CEDS IDS. Let me move up here, stop sharing, go back to the other screen. Okay, so for step 2, the responsibilities that would be on a state for actually loading that data is essentially an exploration of CEDS. You need to get to know the CEDS IDS. The encapsulated code is going to help you load it, but as it does, you'll do some troubleshooting of your own data, your process, and as you do all that, you're going to become familiar with the structure. You'll also, as I mentioned, likely start using it for other purposes, and in doing so, you're going to join a larger community, and you'll be able to contribute back improvements to the CEDS standard with new elements and expansion of the IDS. And so you'll just be part of a larger community able to contribute some things back. One additional contribution that you'll be able to make is in validation. One of the things related to the staging process and the encapsulated code process is a series of scripts that we've created that run validation checks against data in the staging tables. And so that code that we have runs and looks for problems with the data and then logs it into a table and to Generate where you can review it and take a look and see some of the error messages that it's created. An example of one validation check is looking at your option sets, for instance. And it looks and says, does this option set for this student exist in the source system reference data table? So all the kids may have the correct options, except there's this one kid For whatever reason, he has a value on this particular element, and that value does not exist inside of that source system reference table. So either it wasn't added properly to the table, or perhaps the value is wrong in the source data. Something went wrong with this student's particular option set for this element. And so it will take that, capture that information, and log that and say, in this staging table, here's a kid with a bad option set. So we're not able to load the data for this particular student because we can't join to that. A future enhancement of Generate that's being worked on is going to make the error logging table available in the application. So presently it's just available in the database, but it will actually make it available to be viewed in the application, and then also be available to be downloaded from the application as well. And so this is where I mentioned as far as state responsibilities, it's a great opportunity where the Generate community can assist each other. As you view the validation, as you watch the data move from staging and into encapsulated, or from source systems to staging, and you see the validations that exist there and the process that's pre-written right now against your staging tables, you're going to discover new and improved ways to validate that data. And then you will be able to make validation code that is better and that's improved, or looks at it a different way that we hadn't thought of before. And as you do that, that code can be available to other states and vice versa as they make new improvements to the validation process and write new ways to look at the data and find issues. They can make that code available to you. So what Generate covers here is the creation and the maintenance of the encapsulated code, the stored procedures that move the data out of staging and into the CEDS integrated data store. And then for sustainability, as I mentioned, the validation process that looks for potential issues in the data is something else that is continuing to be worked on, and to help make it sustainable in the long run is something we'll all contribute to, both CID and other communities, as well as what you're able to contribute to that validation process. All right, step 3. We've reached step 3 in the data flow, and this is moving the data out of the CEDS IDS and into the CEDS data warehouse. The CEDS IDS is highly normalized. The CEDS warehouse is star schema based. So, which if you're familiar with that at all, fact tables and dimensions that play off that, a little more complex than what I have here, but essentially there's a fact table and then there's different dimensions on that. The warehouse is still a student level database, but it's much easier to query or build reports against, and that makes it easier for Generate to aggregate the data and produce the reports. And again, as you explore this structure, you will likely find additional uses. If you imagine a data warehouse that has fully integrated all data necessary for all EDFacts reports, all the assessment data, all the attendance data, all the special education data, economic disadvantage, migrant, all of the different data necessary at the student level and unit record level, you're likely going to start using that location for other things: research requests, research agendas, data requests, and it's another opportunity where you, as a community of users, Generate users, will be able to share scripts and various different things that you've done. So, hey, look what I did out of the data warehouse, and then somebody else, look what I did out of the data warehouse, and then you switch the code with each other, and you both can do the same thing that you just did. And so it's a great opportunity to be able to utilize that. We're going to take a quick look at the data warehouse. So let me pull that up. So essentially the structure, there we go. So fact tables, dimension tables. Here's an example of just the top 100 from fact student counts. I've joined the DIM demographics, which are the demographic data. So you can see all integer based, -1s for missing data that would be, or may not, make the join to that particular thing. And so here's the different codes: homeless status, LEP, so that's DIM demographics, which is over there. There's also IDA statuses that can be joined to the school, the grade levels, various different dimension tables that make up the picture of the student at a particular time for a particular set of reports. And that's how that's based over there. Let me go ahead and stop sharing here. One thing that I want to mention is the Generate toggle metadata page. So inside the Generate application, there is a section where there are questions that need to be answered by each state related to specific variances in the data. One example on the screen right there is the minimum age for services, and that can vary from state to state. So each state fills this particular toggle in, the data into this. Generate uses this information to correctly pool and produce counts based on how those questions are answered. So the metadata is data your EDFacts coordinator fills out in what is called EMAPs in the EDFacts system. So they go and they fill out this form of EMAPs. Though many of those same questions are also located in Generate. So that Generate uses those answers to ensure it's building the reports according to your state's processes. So for instance, if you put 21, then 22, 23, 24, 26, those ages won't have any zero counts. There'll be no information about those ages. If you put 22, then there would be zero counts for 22 if you didn't have any 22-year-olds. So it takes a look at that metadata behind the scenes to be able to produce the reports accurately. For the movement, as far as state responsibilities in step 3, there are not a lot of responsibilities. Generate handles all of the ETL from the CEDS, IDS, and into the warehouse. So just a continued exploration and understanding of the structure, which again will make it easier to troubleshoot the data issues as well as take advantage of other uses for data in the warehouse. So Generate covers that migration entirely. You would maintain the toggle screen, of course, which would be the answers to those particular questions we talked about. For sustainability and support, I want to make mention of something that's taking place. So CEDS is launching this summer in July an open source community. It'll be officially announced at StatsDC in July, and the purpose is to expand that CEDS data warehouse to a full P20W structure. So presently the CEDS IDS, which is that highly normalized structure where the data starts, it is fully P20W. It contains every CEDS element. But the CEDS data warehouse presently is only K-12 and contains only those elements necessary to do all of EDFacts reporting. So it's a lot of elements to do all of EDFacts reporting, but it's not a full P20W, and it doesn't have every K-12 element. So the open source community project is to begin working on expanding that warehouse to cover every CEDS element, and ideally, all things working correctly, we have that, up and going in July, and then maybe within a year have, most of that project completed. So that's something to note. Finally, we have the last stage, which is the report tables, and this is again all done by Generate. It takes the data out of the data warehouse. It aggregates the data according to the EDFacts file specifications and the category sets, and then it places that data into tables inside of the CEDS database. Let's go over here. The table contains all of the EDFacts report category sets. It contains all of the subtotals, the totals. You can query any of them by report code, by report level, by report year, by the category set code. The only thing you cannot query would be the zero counts. Those are stored. They're not populated. So basically, as the user calls the report, hey, give me C175 or give me C089, and then the zero counts at that point are created and added into it based off of what it reads inside of Toggle, and then where there isn't data for a particular category set, it'll produce the zero counts for that. All right. State responsibilities. Actually, before we do that, let me go over here. I want to just kind of share so you can take a look at this. And there we go. So this would be an example. So over here, if you take a look, the fact actually go down here. Let me lower this down a little bit more. Fact student counts. So that's your data warehouse structure that has the student level data, that has all the joins to the dimension tables. The fact student count reports. So reports on the end. So the reports here, assessment reports, organization account reports. That represents all of the aggregated data and the EDFacts reports themselves. So here's an example here, selecting from fact student count reports. The report code is C089 and the report level is LEA. So it gives you that. Here are the different category sets that exist inside of EDFacts. So the educational environment, the disability codes. All this data is fictional, by the way. You're going to see it says main, but it's not actually true. And then we have student counts. So how many kids in that particular category set, 2, 6, 4, 6, 1, 1, 9. for the various different category set counts. And that's the school district information, because this is the LEA. So you can look at it by LEA or SEA or school. You can query on the category set specifically to see the counts that Generate has produced. So let me stop sharing here. Go back over into here. On this one, state responsibilities, see these last three steps are primarily all about the same. Just explore the data, understand the structure for troubleshooting as well as other uses. So you may have other uses for that EDFacts, those counts there of students for assessments for other purposes. So Generate covers the aggregation of the data, also covers future changes to the EDFacts reports. So new elements that EDFacts adds, changes to the category sets, et cetera. The code will be updated, and then the state can go into their application, check for updates, and then download those updates into the Generate application. So depending on how complex the changes in EDFacts or how simple the changes in EDFacts, there'll be a series of steps that Generate team takes to implement those. Maybe as simple as they just, same data, no change in the data at all, so we're just going to update the category sets. Great, there's really no work on your part. Could be a brand new element gets added, and that would then require updates to the staging tables, updates to possibly to the CEDS integrated data store. If the element already exists in CEDS, great, it's already in all of the structures. If it doesn't exist in CEDS, then it'd be something that would have to add into CEDS, and in the staging tables, the encapsulated code, your script to pull the data from wherever it is you're going to house that data to get it in, and then obviously updates to the Generate application to be able to produce the appropriate category sets for that report. So all along the way, there'll be help from CIID to make those changes related to changes in the EDFacts file specs. Sustainability support, there is the Generate user guide. There is a link there that you can download. And then also the G3, which is the Generate governance group. There is right there, you can email to get information about joining that particular group. So a bunch of states that use Generate working together. And as I mentioned in several of the different slides, there are opportunities for you to be able to contribute back to the community through the validation processes, through the ways that you use the data for research or other purposes beyond just the EDFacts reporting. So lots of opportunities there, and G3 is a great place to get involved to be able to help with some of those things. All right, additional documentation resources available to you. Here are some documents that pertain to Generate, the installation, the implementation guide. I will note on that final one there at the end, the Generate implementation guide, we are currently working on updating that. So it includes all of the staging table processes, the encapsulated code, the validation processes that we're working on now. So there'll be an updated implementation guide, as I mentioned, coming out later on that summer. For documentation, you go to that website there at the bottom. It's cita.grads360.org, and look for information about Generate there to get access to those documents for use. Another useful resource for implementing Generate, or actually really for implementing any data integration that you do in your state, doesn't have to be special ed, doesn't have to be related to EDFacts reports or Generate, but any integration you do is the CIID integration toolkit. A lot of individuals very familiar with integrating data and SEAs came together to build the toolkit. And so if you're about to undertake any integration project, I'd highly recommend this, as it will point out some things that you might miss without a standard process in place. Things I know that as I did integration work when I worked in the state of Oklahoma that I missed. That would have been very helpful to have thought of ahead of time. So some very useful resources. It's a useful resource for any data integration project you're going to do. The other one I had mentioned earlier was the CIID ETL Checklist. That's available also on the CIID website. The resource is a template for your technical documentation for Generate, basically from the source system all the way through to the aggregated reports. It documents all the elements, all the option sets, the transformations that take place. And if you're a Generate state currently being implemented, your TA providers should be working on this with you in the documentation. It is undergoing a bit of transformation presently. It was just your source system into the IDS, but we are expanding it at this point to include everything we can possibly think of, so that the entire data flow from start to finish is documented for you. So that's, again, part of what will come out as part of that package near the end of the summer. And, of course, CEDS, CEDS and the CEDS community. Any updates to CEDS you're going to see out of there, any contributions you want to put in or other additional elements you need, that's a community to get involved in. Version 8 of CEDS is right around the corner. It'll be released in November for comment, and then in February, released out for good. And as I've mentioned throughout, the ETL templates that we're working on will be available late summer. And then, of course, the CEDS open source community, which will be announced at StatsCC, along with how to get involved and stay up to date with work taking place there. Great place to get connected. Several states are moving actually towards a complete CEDS implementation to include their entire infrastructure. So not just generate, but actually their whole SLDS or K-12 SEA infrastructure will be CEDS. So that's part of that open source community. And we are actually finally going to take a poll. No, one more thing. Then we'll do the poll, right? Yeah. Right. One more thing. What additional resources would be helpful to you? So if we did not think of the documentation, what would be something that you would need that we could provide for you? So you think of it and you're like, hey, it would have been helpful if you had thought of this. Email cynthia@amcorp.com, and we would then work on getting that resource available and created that will help you out. Now we're going to do some Q&A, and we're going to see if we have any questions that came through, which I can see. And it looks like we do have a question there, if I can pull it up to see. And will you be covering loading the RDS with aggregate? If someone could read that out for me, because for whatever reason, my screen will not allow me to see that whole question. There we go. Now I got it. Will you be covering loading the RDS with aggregate counts directly for data collected at aggregate instead of individuals? A good question. So there are going to be, if you're going to use Generate for all of your EDFacts reporting, which makes complete sense to do, I don't know why you would only use it for a portion of your EDFacts. So ideally, you're going to use it for all of your EDFacts reporting. You're going to run into situations where you don't collect the unit record data. So you maybe it's personnel data, and the district just provides you with a listing of numbers. Let me go over into here. Let me share my screen. You would ideally want to house all of that data in one location. So while Generate will produce from the unit record data all the EDFacts reports for you, if you don't have the unit record data, you only have the aggregates, you would still want to have that probably in the final location so that you can take advantage of using the application to build the reports and to have it all in one spot and not another spot. So essentially for doing that, you would come straight to that particular reports table. So depending on whether it's an organization count or an assessment count or a student count or a personnel count, you're going to load the data in this particular location, being careful to put in everything that's necessary, so the different category sets, different codes, populating those, and then the counts themselves. So the location where you would load that aggregate information would be straight into fact student count reports. You're not going to have the ability to take advantage of the integrated data, obviously from the warehouse perspective, where it links to other data, but you would have the ability to store it in that fact student count reports. I think that would probably answer the question. So yeah, it would go straight into one of those reports tables if you had only the aggregate counts. So let me go back over here. See if there's any other questions. Another question. For the ETL checklist that you're working on with states, is that documentation stored on a shared workspace? It's probably it depends on whether or not the community's been set up or whether the state has like a shared place where they want to have that located. So it would be each individual state and how they would handle that particular scenario. So it's not in a shared workspace presently. It'd be provided to the state directly. And again, that's something that we're working on expanding out and hope to have that completed here in the next month or so. in much greater detail. Each of the different developers, Johnny and myself and Nathan and another couple individuals, are taking on the task of expanding that all the way from the staging all the way to the end. So there's templates available. So again, the templates will be available. Staging all the way to the reports, that's the same. No matter what you do, it doesn't matter how you have it. Staging all the way to the end is the same. The only part that would have to be filled in by states, which we're helping with for the IDA reports, would be your source location into staging. Once we get that filled into the templates, then you have the entire process all the way through. So another question, follow-up from Richard would be, how do we know which fields to populate in the RDS? Is there an example of each that could be used for reference? I'm assuming this goes back to that aggregate question. That's something we can work with you on. We haven't done a lot in relation to providing guides for how to do that. So that would probably be a good resource for us to take down for a guide to how to actually load the RDS with the aggregate data so that you would know what fields would need to be filled in for those particular reports. And so, yeah, get with your project team, whoever your project lead is, and ask them about that. And then we can see what the particular need is for that actual type. I'm guessing it's probably personnel, but we might be able to develop out a resource to help with that particular use case. And then Bill's responded in here, the director of CIID, that the CIID TA lead for each state can work out access to the ETL templates. So for those ETL checklists, you can go with your CIID TA lead, and they'll help you find those documents that are being worked on for your state. All right. Not seeing any other questions presently, I'll move on to the next thing. Yes. Okay. If there's any more questions, though, feel free to put them in the chat box. We're going to do a poll real quick here. What technical questions remain? Or would you like to further discuss with your TA provider? So a poll is going to come up here. If you have anything else that you want to ask about in relation to that, answering that question, go ahead and type your answer in there and submit those. We'll just take a minute to work on that. If there's any other technical questions that you want to go over, again, this is pretty high level, so but it talks about the data flow, and the implementation guides and things we're putting out this summer will help understand in much more depth what we covered today. So I'm going to give you a few more minutes. Looks like you get about 20 more seconds or so to answer that. And while that's over there on the side, I'll go ahead and bring up contact information as well. So myself, Nathan, and Johnny, our email addresses are there. Different information for reaching CIID, which hopefully you all know by now, but maybe not. All right, that poll is ended. Let me take a quick look and see if there's any other questions in the Q&A. Not seeing any presently. I think then that would just about wrap it up. If you do end up with any other questions, or if this was too high level and you want to get deeper into the weeds, definitely feel free to reach out to any of us there on the screen, and we'd be happy to go into more depth with you. As we go through with the different states and the different cohorts, we're going to be working on helping you, transition over to sustainability. And so further discussions and trainings related to how you'll use the staging tables, the encapsulated code, and that sort of thing will be things that we'll be working on with the states as we transition you over to being able to write some of this code on your own, then being able to implement some additional EDFacts reports. Going to look if there's any more questions. Not seeing any. That's great. Thank you all for attending. I hope this session was helpful, and have a great day.
Thanks, Glenn.